Let's welcome in Dave Poulin for his thoughts on the Jets and the rest of the National Hockey League. Poulin, what's up? Hope you had a great weekend. We certainly did here in Winnipeg. Amazing what a couple wins can do for a team and a fan base.
It really is amazing, and that's the ebbs and flows of what we're going through right now, those last 20 games. Actually, the article I wrote in the Star on Sunday was about, wait a second, we still have 20 games left? Like, you think the trade deadline's done, and here we go, we're going to work, and we don't have to worry about anything else. But no, there's a lot of hockey left to be played, and I think that it's already playoffs, Andrew, and in the way you handle the time between games is so critical right now. And I'm speaking to the fans as well as the players and the broadcasters as well as the players, because, in a 7-game series, you win the first game, well, you're on cloud 9, but you can't be because you have to play game 2. And likewise, if you lose the first game, you have lost the series. And yet that's the way wins and losses are going right now. Everybody's looking, but they're computing points, and they're computing other teams' schedules, and they're computing all these different factors that go into play. And you have to worry about your own games and play your own games. I think Winnipeg did an excellent job of doing that. And maybe the weather had a little bit to do with it. Maybe it was like, you know what, we're in sunny Florida, we're allowed to smile, and we're allowed to be good. And they were.
The funny thing is, in years past, sometimes that Florida break has not necessarily been a positive for the performance of the Jets or other teams. But, I mean, to be frank, Dave, it really did seem like the Jets were in a real crisis situation. I mean, they had been dropping. They had probably the worst record in the league over the last dozen games. All the hard work that they built that lead up earlier in the year had evaporated. And you come off 2 really good games played at home with only 1 point to show for it, and then go out on maybe the most daunting road trip and schedule of the season. How important can one win for a team that's struggling, for a team that hasn't had good things go well for them? That was not a blueprint game on Saturday night against the Panthers, but they got a win. How much can just one result do for a team that desperately needs it?
It's one result with tangible points attached to it. And the games you talk about, my experience has always been that when you're going through a real struggle, you play well before you win. And just like when you're on a long winning streak, you play a couple games and like, yeah, we weren't great, but we won. And going in and out of those types of streaks, you're going to have these times at some points during the year. You're just flat out going to. Everybody does. I mean, even Boston's in a massive 2-game losing streak over the last 2 weeks, aren't they?
Yeah, for their standard.
Yeah, but everybody's going to have them. So when would you rather have them? Well, for me, I'd rather have them with 20 games left in the season, when you can address them and adjust and not have this be, you have a terrible 2-week period in the first round of the playoffs, you're done. So you'd hope that it's out of the way, you've addressed some things that you have to address. And it's so hard to address them when you're winning, Andrew. As much as you would say, I've been on both sides of it. I've spoken in a locker room, I've sat and listened in a locker room. When you're winning and the coach comes in and says, we have to do this, this, and this, your tendency is to look at the guy next to you and go, what's he so upset about? We're winning, we'll fix it. And that's not, Rick Bowness knew what he was talking about when they were still winning. And then they got, into a situation where they couldn't get a win. So those last 2 games where you come up with only 1 point in those last couple games, he was stressing that we're playing better. They have to understand we're playing better. We have to keep doing the things we're doing, and we'll be rewarded. And I thought in Florida, in both games are rewarded. And, you lose a player of the stature of Josh Morrissey that you lose, and yet you find a way to get it done. Dylan Sandberg, I thought, did a nice job last night coming in. But you found a way to get it done against 2 teams that are desperate in their own right. I mean, Florida is just trying to be there, and Tampa Bay's gone through arguably their toughest stretch in the last 3 years. So I think they're better wins than they even look right now in terms of getting the job done. And yet some huge contributions as well. I think, Niederreiter starting to fit in, starting to contribute, and, across the board, everybody's got to contribute to be in a good place at this point of the year.
The irony about Niederreiter is, I think last week when there'd been a real power outage of some of the top players, the power play, and he's been the one guy that's been consistently scoring. I mean, what an addition he's been. And Namestnikov's been very, very much a factor as well. But Dave, I want to go back to Saturday for a minute because, as I mentioned, I mean, the shots in the game were just about 2-1 for Florida. Connor Hellebuck had a rough couple of games coming in. The power play hadn't been scoring. There was a number of things that happened in that game that you probably didn't like, obviously them coming back, but yet you got to win and hit on a number of things that were missing in a game. Special teams, certainly. I mean, the penalty kill's been elite for the Winnipeg Jets pretty much all season long, despite getting victimized on the weekend in that game. But tell us about a power play and how you can go through a period of time where things just don't seem in sync, and what a little bit of success can do for a unit like we saw this weekend for the Jets.
The power play is arguably the most scouted thing in the game. And when a power play is good, it's scouted that much more. When it has the components that Winnipeg has. And so what are you focused on the power play? The driver on the backside was Josh Morrissey, yes. I think the key person up front is Kyle Connor because of where he shoots, how he shoots. So when you're scouting through the course of a year, you watch another team's success against. So let's look at Florida. Florida's saying, okay, who's been good against Winnipeg's power play recently? And just pick 3 teams. Say these 3 teams, Minnesota shut them down. What did they do? And then it gets really specific. Well, they took away the past 2 Connors. So we're going to take away the past 2 Connors. So you have something tangible to teach your guys. And that's why, Andrew, quite frankly, the power play is very often less of a factor in the playoffs. There's less penalties called, and the scouting is so sophisticated and so ingrained in guys' minds. And I was a penalty killer. And you knew that the more I saw you do something, if you keep repeating it because it's successful, eventually I'm going to shut it down. And so you have to change it up. You have to be willing to alter it. And ultimately, what it has to start with, for me, if my power play is struggling, is a shot on net and a puck retrieval. So now I'm asking my power play guys to do the hardest job, that's get the puck back. But they have to be willing to do that. They can't go to their favorite spots, lock in, and think it's going to work. And every team goes through it, so you've got to be willing to adjust. And that's why I don't mind the tinkering of a guy here or there either, different in a different spot, just to change things up. So the other team is saying, okay, well, we haven't seen them do that. Let's adjust to that. And so I think it's inevitable. It's why even the truly elite power plays, as you witness right now in Edmonton, goes through times when we're just going to sit on Leon Draisaitl over here. We're not letting them touch the puck. And, and Connor's going to have to beat us and things like that, that inevitably you go through.
One of the topics that we'd hit on the program was sort of wondering at one point the personnel was going to be shaken up a little bit, and specifically with Nikolaj Ehlers. I mean, at the start of the year, he was penciled in as a number 1 power play guy, missed all that time, has not really spent much time at all on that top unit, and it hadn't been working. They stayed with it, especially with the arrival of Niederreiter, and got some success this week. But at the same time, Nikolaj Ehlers, and I think this goes back to the San Jose and especially the Minnesota game, looked a little bit more dangerous, looked like he was getting back into his groove. But he scored, and you could see him on the television on Saturday night. I believe the words was, "It's about bleeping time," to get that goal and to get back on. We've talked about Nick beforehand, but he's missed a lot of time, maybe took a little bit of time to get back to his top level, but had struggled lighting the lamp. What have you seen of his play over the last week? And for a player like that to actually get some results, much like the team overall, what can that do individually for going forward for a guy that, honestly, this team needs so much from?
He's an enormous boost to the squad. There's no question. And when you think about Nikolaj, if you said to me, where is his exact spot on the team? That's not an easy answer. It's just not. And it's been a changing spot, even if you go back a couple of years, because, at one point you'd say, well, the first line is clearly at one point Scheifele, Wheeler, and Connor. And you say, okay, well, where does that put Nikolaj? Well, who's the second line center that day and who's he playing with? And it's been somebody different. And now you introduce Pierre-Luc Dubois, and are you worried about the other pieces? Because he's a versatile guy, he can play either side. And because of his speed and because he can play the individual game, he's not a guy that you worry about when you're listing. It's almost like he's the last option of the 6. Okay, we'll just put Nikolaj there. And it's not fair, but it comes with his versatility, and it comes with the fact that he can be a solo artist as well. And sometimes that's, I mean, as good a player as he is, because he doesn't have to rely on 2 other guys, you don't worry about placing him as much. A weird concept, actually. You're almost cursed by your own skill set. And I think that's sometimes what it is. But when he first came back, like the first game or two, he was flying. And when he's using his speed, to me, the most dangerous Nikolaj Ehlers is when he's coming from behind. He's coming back deep in the zone. You can see him building up the speed. He's coming full tank at you. And that's when he causes major, major issues. And then, who's playing off him. So once, Dubois gets back in the lineup and is healthy and we get that measure done, as that happens now, how does Niederreiter fit in? What's the makeup going to be? But these are good problems to have as everybody gets healthy.
Well, I mean, it is just funny. I mean, we think back to training camp, the things that were different about this club. And one of the things that Rick Bowness said right off the bat was Nikolaj Ehlers was going to be on the top line, was going to be on the top power play, plays 2 games, misses half the season. And now it seems the landscape of the team is very much different. Bottom line is they need both of those lines to be going. And
no question.
Ehlers is a big part of it. But this does go back to injuries, Dave. And one of the familiar refrains I heard from friends over the course of the weekend was, why does it take this team to lose a bunch of their top players to raise that level? I mean, one could argue, the best stretch this team had all year was when they were missing Ehlers and Wheeler and Nate Schmidt and Mason Appleton. And the lull has sort of happened over the past month since this team's been as healthy as it's been all year. And then guys go down this weekend, important players, Adam Lowry and then Josh Morrissey on the back end yesterday. And it seems like the team steps up in a way that they haven't in the past. Is there any rhyme or reason to this?
No, there's not. There really isn't. I think it's always been the case. Maybe there's a slight bit more desperation in each individual's game because they realize they have a little bit more to give. But ideally, when that happens and the player comes back in the lineup, everybody takes what they've done to elevate, continues, and you're adding a Josh Morrissey back in or a Lowry back in or a Dubois back in or whomever it may be that was out. And that's the ultimate. That's why I always feared teams that were dangerous, because they were getting bodies in. Someone else had maybe an unexpected role thrust on them, and they're able to maintain that role and add to their game. And, that's why when you see a team, I would still fear a team like Colorado, who's had so many guys with such low mileage this year. Because if you get a Landeskog back and he plugs in, well, so much has been expected of Rantanen or JT Compher, who now bumps down to the lineup. So that is a phenomena that I've never been able to explain. I don't think anybody's been able to explain. And it's almost like I've got to be better, so I'm better because someone's out. And my argument as a coach is, why don't you just be better all the time when he's in as well? And, it seems to make more sense that way, but it's not the case.
I have to mention Morgan Barron. And Adam Lowry, I think most of us thought from what Rick Bowness had to say after Saturday night's game that Adam Lowry was going to be out and you were going to be down 2 of your most important centers behind Mark Scheifele. That wasn't the case. And that line was so impactful yesterday. And Morgan Barron in particular, Dave, over the past, week and a half, almost when Namestnikov came. Remus and I were talking about before that Edmonton game back at home when Namestnikov made his debut and played with Lowry and Barron. They have looked like a different line. Now, since then, Namestnikov's moved up and taken Dubois' place at center, and Mason Appleton's got his right back, and that might have been Mason Appleton's best game of the season. But in particular, we've talked about Adam Lowry a lot, but Barron, Appleton, contributions of players like that in the bottom 6 that, have very challenging matchups on the other side of the rink, what that does for a team and how you get onto a bit of a run for players in that role. And when I think back of great playoff teams, those are the teams that have third lines that can obviously take care of things defensively, but also contribute offensively. And it seems like maybe for this Winnipeg Jets third line, that's starting to happen.
You think about big goals in key games, be it a Game 7 in Tampa, Toronto, where Nick Paul gets 2 goals. And that's exactly what you're talking about. But Morgan Barron is a result of something I've spoken about before in the show. And I think the first time I addressed it was in the Trouba trade, when you got sort of an unknown defenseman named Neil Pionk with the first round draft pick. And in this case, Barron comes over in the Cop deal. And there wasn't a lot known about Morgan Barron at that point. And, he'd been at Cornell. He played in the minors. He'd had a cup of coffee in the NHL. That's just excellent scouting by both your pro and amateur guys. And it's the combination of conversation that has to go on between them, because you have to go back to your amateur guys and say, okay, where do we have Barron in the draft? Okay, why did he go where he went? Knew he was going to college, spent his time at Cornell, comes out. What do we think of now? What's he done in the American League? What's his upside? And that information all goes into the blender, and you come out and say, in the Cop deal, we've got to get a kid named Morgan Barron in the deal. And because a team is desperate and they're in the playoff mode, they're going to give him up at that point, much easier than they give him up in the summer. So I like that aspect of it. But he's a big guy, moves well, and, he's done what you asked him to do. The reason that he's important is because as a Jets team can play a different type of playoff series, I think he brings a little bit more to a heavier series. And depending on who, in a perfect world, who you end up with in the first round, you go ahead, you make the playoffs, you make the first round and say, okay, who's our opposition? Now you start planning. I think Barron's a versatile guy that gives you a piece of a heavier game.
Well, and he hasn't been a real rough player, but has certainly got into it. And I think as the energy in these games and maybe some of the physicality steps up, I mean, that's an invitation for him to do that as well. But Dave,
he'll benefit too, Andrew. He'll benefit from watching Niederreiter and watching where that big body goes around the net and watching how he hangs out. I'd put a special assignment on Morgan Barron and say, just watch where Niederreiter goes around the net.
Well, speaking of Niederreiter, maybe you can touch on him and just what an addition he's been to the Winnipeg Jets. Because I mean, if you break down every trade that was made, the value the Jets got for Niederreiter for a second-round pick with an extra year might have been at the top of the list. But Dave, you followed this league for a long time in a number of roles. The one thing that stood out to me about this deadline, now that we can look back at it, and it speaks to what you were just mentioning about the playoff style and how the game is different, is the price that teams were willing to pay for players, maybe without the offensive pedigree, but with major two-way games and physicality. And I think back to the haul that Nashville got for Tanner Jeannot, which nobody saw. And then what Buffalo ended up paying for Jordan Greenway. And obviously Minnesota having Ryan Reeves, maybe it was a little bit more. But I mean, you were talking about it was a second and a fifth for a 2-goal player for Greenway. The Jets got Niederreiter for a second. Can you explain, what do you make of the premium that certain teams are paying for tougher, more physical players at the deadline, and why are they doing that?
I think it goes back to some specific additions that have had huge factors. And you look at Tampa Bay, and I started with Barclay Goodrow and Blake Coleman. When those two prices were paid respectively to San Jose and Jersey, everyone raised their eyebrows and said, you've got to be kidding me. But there was control left on contracts, and they played a specific role. And you think of that line, what they did in those playoff runs with Yanni Gourde, and it was the perfect complementary third line. And, Julian Briswell went out and did it again with Nick Paul. He did it with Brandon Hagel. They set a price, so he did it with Tanner Jeannot. Now, there's been a lot of study lately on the impact of the draft. And, if you really look at a team deep down and say, one of the things I do is when I do my rosters for games, how many guys did you draft and how many are trades? And, if you look at the Jets defense, virtually, a number of them were traded for. Sandberg was a draft who went to college. Morrissey was obviously a draft, and the other guys were all trades. And so when you start looking at it like that, you're saying, okay, what's the value of a draft pick? And a draft pick to Julian Briswell, who is building around a specific set of guys who've won him 2 cups, by the way, and gone to the finals a third time. And, a first-round draft pick in a year or two is not going to play, arguably, with Steven Stamkos at his best. And so that's how you wait it out. But Nashville's an interesting case of subtraction. You think of their subtraction, Niederreiter, subtracted Jeannot, you subtracted Michael Granlund, you subtracted Matthias Ekholm, you don't have Ryan Johansson, and you're one of the hottest teams in the league right now. And, so what you did do is name a new general manager for next year in Barry Trotz, but it's remarkable to me. There's always a team that subtracts that now gets, for whatever reason, the right mix of guys in the locker room and on the ice, and looks at each other and says, well, clearly our management team doesn't think we're going anywhere, but what about us? What do we think? And that gets to be a dangerous team.
Well, Nashville is that team right now, although, still 6 points back of the Jets. But, it does seem like for the contending teams and teams that have been in the playoffs before, that have had great victories, that have had losses, there is a real premium to be paid on those players with a physical edge to their game. And I think it caught some people surprised with some of the prices that went out, but there's a reason for that.
Different types of games. It enables you to play in different types of games. The Leafs did it absolutely. Not only Ryan O'Reilly, but Noel Acciari would be one that you would mention, but they tried this before in Toronto, and it, you've got to fit those guys in as well.
Yeah.
And you've got to make them a part of things. But they're important guys in the playoffs because the game's a little bit different in the playoffs, Andrew. And you're playing the same team over and over again. And if you get into a series that doesn't fit your style of play, you're not going to last very long. And sometimes it's that specific matchup. And that, there's like Brendan Dillon will be more valuable in the playoffs than he is. He's a very good regular season player. He's more valuable in the playoffs because they're going to let him play a little more Brendan Dillon type of game. And, he's going to be allowed to clear out the front of the net just a little bit more. And the opposition knows that, and they get a little more reluctant to go there when that's allowed. So that's why that type of game, you're hoping that, a Nino Niederreiter, he doesn't care. He's going in front of the other team's net. He doesn't care who's there or who thinks they're going to move him out. He's going there. And he's proven that he's going there. And that's when I reference Morgan Barron as, someone who watches a Niederreiter sitting on the bench and watches and says, that power play goal he scores the other night it's a front of the net goal. He's in the crease when he bangs that in.
Well, we spend a lot of time obviously talking about Niederreiter, but I'll tell you what, Namestnikov had himself a weekend as well. A couple goals. And this is a guy that was supposedly coming in as a depth player in the bottom six, a fourth liner. He's playing important minutes on the second line, is scoring, and he's got a level of defensive responsibility that I'm not sure a lot of people knew that he had that club in his bag, but it's been on display a number of times, and I'm sure it's been putting a smile on Rick Bowness's face.
The one person on our panel who sort of lit up over that was Mike Johnson. And on trade deadline day, he said that's a really, really sneaky good pickup for Winnipeg because he was a little bit under the radar. He'd been moved, and he does have the first round pedigree and has played different roles in different places. And sometimes you just get him at a perfect time in his career. And I think maybe that's what happened. But even being able to step up short term and fill a bigger role. And then now this is what's going to happen. Dubois comes back. Namestnikov drops back down in the lineup. If that's your fourth line center in the playoffs, after Scheifele, Dubois, and Lowry, man, you're in good shape. You're in really good shape because you have no qualms about running four lines out there.
Well, and he was playing with Lowry and Barron when he first came into the lineup. And I think, with the way things looked last night, maybe they keep Appleton there, but certainly a few more options for Rick Bowness.